Thank you, and I'm honored to have such a distinguished panel. You know, I'm a little surprised some of my students I'm seeing for the first time in their uniforms. I don't know whether to salute or just give them A's right now. So, you know what they didn't say about the secretary is I believe you were in the 10th Mountain Division. Was that right?
I was. Along with the secretary.
Yeah.
Served there at the same time.
And sir, did you really get a master's degree from the Naval Postgraduate School?
I
did.
Nobody's perfect. It's all right.
Right, no one's perfect. And how many of you, again, are startups or VCs? Just raise your hand. How many of you can now diagram what PAEs are? Okay, great. So I thought that was a great explanation. If you don't mind, let me try it again. You know, so the Army, and in fact the whole Department of War, thinks of acquisition, that is how they buy, with a big A and a little a. Is that a fair way to describe it? That is, there's the entire acquisition ecosystem, and then they're the guys who actually are responsible for buying the stuff. And these used to be silos, like individual things that literally took months or years to move paperwork across the building. And the breakthrough after 60 years was this administration, this Secretary of Defense said, this is insane. Which, by the way, if you've been VCs or startups, we've been saying that, but somebody finally paid attention and decided to concatenate that entire ecosystem under one group called a portfolio acquisition executive. And the Army has 6 of them plus the PIT. Is that correct? Let's see, PAE Air, PAE Maneuver Ground, PAE Fires.
Command and control.
Layer protection integration, C2 and counter C2. And what is agile sustainment and ammunition.
Right. So those are the 6 ecosystems for acquisition inside the Army. And underneath those, that's the big A. And underneath them are the people who actually do the work of acquisition. And that is CPEs. They used to be called Program Executive Officers, and now they're called, sir, Capability?
Capability Program Executives is what we call them.
And, sir, what does a CPE do, and how did the PA kind of affect your life?
So I think it depends on your perspective. Did we replace the PEOs, or did we rebrand them and create a new level? I kind of take the other view. The PEOs were now Capability Program Executives. We still are operating much the same way that we did, but part of a larger construct. The power of the PAEs is that we created portfolios around the warfighting systems. And what that really does is it gives you a formation view. And so rather than talking about every product as an individual thing, we're now talking about portfolios, and we're talking about formations. And when we get to the Army senior leader level for what we're calling our capability portfolio reviews that happen a few times a year, we're talking across a full portfolio of capabilities and how we make trades to get the warfighting capability we need. Now, we're not specifically talking about individual things. That's pretty important.
And you're responsible for autonomy. That's a pretty big word, all right? Is that like robots in factories, or what's autonomy for the Army?
So autonomy is very cross-cutting. It hits all the PAEs. So, and I'll speak here in a few minutes and talk about where I'm aligned, and I'm actually moving right now from one PAE to the other. But we support across all of the PAEs. So ground systems, air systems. We must be tied into C2 systems. You get into payloads, there's electronic warfare applications, there's counter UAS. When you're talking unmanned systems and autonomy, it hits all of those areas. So that's the challenge of it.
And the example I keep thinking about for Army and autonomy is that Ukrainians are using unmanned vehicles to actually do resupply and contested logistics, and the rest is that how I should think about some of the parts of what you're working on, or should?
I think that's one way of looking at it. I think too often we look at it as individual things, single UAS, or now, I mean, I've seen a lot of news from Ukraine over the past few weeks about they're now using ground robots to take and hold ground.
Wow.
That's a new paradigm, and you know, President Zelensky is really up in the narrative on use of unmanned ground vehicles. I think the power is when we network those systems and create interconnected systems, leveraging the sensor data and fighting them one to many. And once you've done that, and you then have the ability to lay in technologies that still need to mature, but I think will unlock a lot of potential, and that's to orchestrate large formations of unmanned systems.
So I think you said something important. Let me just make sure I play it back. It's not only building a robot, right, and an unmanned robot that could achieve a mission, but it's actually connecting all of them so they can actually operate like an army would, right, rather than an individual thing. That's a whole nother level of sophistication.
Correct, and that's what makes it challenging too. It's cross-cutting across all of our user communities, across our PEOs. It cuts across the way we fund things. We like to describe and fund things in very discrete terminology. Integration forces you to break down those barriers, and traditionally no one has owned that connective tissue to bring it all together. And that is what I embrace as my primary role, is that I own that connective tissue, and we're system-to-system focused, not focused on individual platforms and payloads.
So does that mean you're actually building an autonomy platform inside of?
So what I would, I often say that what I consider my core program, it's not a capability in and of itself. It's a unified C2 architecture. A MOSA approach to connecting unmanned systems, that the end state we're trying to get to is that when industry brings in a new UAS or a new ground robot or a new payload, the integration standards are clearly understood because we have an architecture that industry is aligned on. And
That's JADC2, or is that something?
JADC2 is, I mean, at the larger level, that's where we started years ago. Next Gen C2 is what we're building out in the Army, and I see what we're building for unmanned systems as a subset of that, with Next Gen C2 and other systems as interfaces. But really, at the tactical edge where unmanned systems will operate, you need an architecture so that those things become plug and play, and commanders can configure packages of capability around the problem that they need to solve.
So, for example, a drone swarm might be an example of
a drone swarm. Rather than having a soldier driving or flying every individual drone, having a soldier that can control many drones to attack a series of targets, using aided target recognition and call for fire algorithms to quickly close kill chains. One of the things that we're working on right now is a package of capability to do a complex breach for the Armored Brigade combat team. So everything from the surveillance and reconnaissance phase all the way through obstacle reduction, lane proofing, and marking. Tying all those pieces together. Very complex operation, but we think it's feasible that can be done with unmanned systems, taking humans out of that very dangerous operation.
So where are those systems going to come from? Is it going to come from primes, startups here, or is it being built in our FFRDCs or service labs?
So it's coming from across the spectrum. Some of the primes are in this space. Really, where I see the investment is this community right here that's represented. It's one of the reasons I'm here. I think it's really important to communicate both to the investors about where we need to invest, as well as the startups in unmanned ground vehicles, UAS, and the platforms, and guide those investments to get the outcomes that we need.
And so will startups use the pit to come find you, or Fuse, or how do they find you? They just heard you, they said, yes, we got one of those. How many want to raise your hand and like, yeah, see, they're all here. How do they, don't let him leave, he has the bag of money in the back, you bring it out. No, seriously, sir, how do they connect through Fuse to you, to the Army Secretary, going, hey, over here, we heard what you said?
Yeah, well, now that the word's out, I can tell you, it doesn't seem that people have any problem connecting with me.
Right. So what do you want to hear?
Can I actually jump in there? Because
Sorry.
No. I mean, you're actually talking to the right guy. I'm just. But this is an area that I'm interested in learning a lot more. I think I'm hyper aware of the front door has been opaque. I think Fuse is a step in the right direction.
Huge.
It is a step in the right direction. But we're doing these kind of demand signal forums where you can have a guy like me come and kind of yap at you for 20 minutes every 6 months or so. But how do we make that ecosystem more collaborative and have more of a two-way communication flow? It's a hard challenge to solve, and there's all the weird laws around who you can talk to and when. But that's what I would love to have those discussions with some of the people in this room based on their experiences and what can we set up and get going that will enable those conversations going forward.
That's unbelievable coming from a Secretary of Army. Yeah. Thank you. And let me riff on that and say, what don't you want to hear from a startup or VC? Is it like, hey, I got a shiny object, or is it you want to hear something about, here's how we're going to solve your problem? What would be the best way to talk to you or the people who work for you?
I think when someone comes up in with a product looking for a solution, so not demonstrating a clear understanding of the problems that we need to solve, to me that's looking at it from the wrong perspective. So I think what we would like to see
Pay attention.
is industry to come in really with a, asking questions about what are the problems that we need to solve and how can they help. And quite honestly, we are seeing a lot of that from industry. I think, from my perspective, I take a self-critical look at this. I don't think we do a good enough job on the Army side of communicating what our true priorities are.
That's what I was.
And back to your early question about, how do we engage through the PIT? PIT's a really important concept, and I work very closely in partnership with Colonel Dayon and that team. The PIT is working to connect that bottom-up innovation that we see springing up, not just from industry, but also innovation centers across the Army, with where all the resources still lie, and that is within the PAEs now. And so the PIT is working to identify the problems through the user community and operational units, the technologies that are right to invest in, but then also, before we make those investments, finding a landing spot and a PAE that will sponsor them and catch them over the long term. That is the gap that we've traditionally had, is finding the landing spot for the innovation that we see.
But now that's you.
That is me, and I have 12 or 13 counterparts across the enterprise as well doing the same thing.
Now, historically, requirements, right, the spec of what you should buy were written by a different group, right? Where's that today?
So that falls within that PAE construct.
Right.
So requirements are still the responsibility of T2Com. So that dual support or dual reporting relationship. So T2Com has the statutory authority for requirements. Acquisition authorities still flow through acquisition channels. The PAE brings all that together. And again, I think that's the power of that concept of having a PAE who is responsible for driving outcomes across both of those things, acquisition and requirements.
Can I jump in on that one too? I mean, so from the big picture, that was one of the fundamental problems that I think we needed to solve. Like Sec Army, I don't know if any of you have ever heard him speak, but he always has this kind of classic example that he goes to when we developed the 1911 Colt. The requirements document was like 3 pages long. When we went back out for our most recent pistol, 10 years ago or something, it was 400 pages for the handgun. And so it just kind of shows like this thing had just gotten so out of control. And so I think it's a move in the right direction with this dual support role, where now you have, in theory, requirements and acquisition kind of rolling up to a single executive. But I think we need to, in some cases, and I don't know, General Gibbs, you might disagree with me, but kind of better define for those PAEs like what their trade space is in those requirements. Like how much latitude do they have to play around in there? And so we're kind of now coming up on like the six-ish month mark of really having kind of kicked these off in earnest. And so I think that's one of the things that we're going to start doing at our level over the next few months, is having more direct kind of check-ins with the PAEs and getting some of the lessons learned and what's going right, what's not going as well. Now that we're a little bit into this and have some kind of like actionable feedback.
So, sir, you're just making me think, for this audience, should they also be talking to the folks in T2Com or getting the T2Com folks out to Silicon Valley and other places? Just let's use autonomy as an example.
Yeah, I mean, like we have events all the time. So like next week I'm going to Ivy Mass, where we're demoing a bunch of new capabilities for our next Gen C2 out in Colorado. Our national training centers, we're constantly bringing in new capabilities. I mean, that's sort of what General George tried to institutionalize through the TIC initiative, is like, how do we get the capability into the hands of the soldiers and then co-locate the developers with those soldiers so you can get the real-time feedback. So there are opportunities all over the place to get your kit in a formation. It doesn't have to be through a formal competition, but like the fuse or the pit is probably the best front door for a lot of the early stage stuff now. And then I think that's where you get the kind of the feedback, the what worked well, what didn't, how did a unit incorporate that into their formations at what echelon, and then that gets systematized over to T2Com to help start developing the requirements. So doctrine doesn't change as much, but like the TTPs will change much more frequently, and that's what we're trying to keep up with. So I do think T2COM has a key role to play in, you know, what we're bringing in and what we're experimenting with as well.
And sir, how are we keeping up with what's going on in Ukraine and the Iran war for the Army and autonomy? Either one of you. I mean, where do those lessons get integrated all the way into, gee, we thought we were buying X 3 years ago, and holy cow, look what the Russians and Ukrainians have done in the last 6 months. How do we keep up with that pace?
So what I see, sir, so SAGU, Lieutenant General Buzzard leads that effort, and he has a...
For everyone, SAGU is?
It's
Supreme Allied.
Sorry, wasn't the quiz.
I was way off, man.
Security Assistance Group Ukraine, what that stands for.
Which does what?
So working very closely with the Ukrainians. Headquarters stood up in Poland. We've had that in place for about 3 years. General Donahue, when he was 18th Airborne Corps commander, really stood that initial effort up, and that has kept going. So that is really our on-the-ground, bird's-eye view of what's going on.
So we're sucking in those.
So sucking that into T2COM, I get those on a weekly basis, those reports, and so we see them.
Are we getting whiplashed with that?
And so my perspective is that, you know, I think we're being very careful to learn the right lessons from that. There's a certain way that we want to fight. You know, in our Army, we have, you know, combined arms maneuver. We want to seize the initiative, and we want to continue to fight that way. We do understand that the dynamics and the character of war are changing right before our eyes. So the thing that we're being careful about is to learn the right lessons to inform the right investments as we move forward. And I know we've got Colonel Jeff Shunke here is going to join me here in a few minutes on a panel. He's doing the same thing, looking at the Indo-PACOM theater and the threats in that environment and what investments that we need to make and what concepts we need in that theater as well. So that's something we focus a lot on.
I guess from my perspective, the lessons, you know, I think General Gibbs said it well, is we fight very differently, I think. So I think we do have to be cautious on over-indexing on like the specific kind of tactical lessons pulling from Ukraine. I think the big picture that conflict has laid bare, and I think people are acutely aware of now and are working to solve it, is a lot of the flexibility issues that I sort of tried to allude to in my opening remarks. Kind of this, you know, the systemic constraints on how we operate, because they are free and clear of that. You know, just for example, like even using DJI drones, right? Like back in the early days, they're able to just get stuff off the shelf. They can tweak it. They can kind of trick it out in their garage, and you know, and they just had a much more adaptive, entrepreneurial kind of garage band sort of approach to getting some of those capabilities fielded because they were in an existential fight. And I don't think we have adopted that mindset of like, how would we operate if we were in a similar scenario? And then like, let's start there, and then, you know, work in some risk calibration on approach. But like right now, the system just gets so locked into process and you know, oversight, and all those things have a role and a good reason for existing. But until we can kind of unlock some of our structural changes and some of the other fiscal flexibility things that I mentioned, like we're just not going to ever be able to be as adaptive of that. And so I think that's why we are exploring ways right now to be more collaborative with industry. Like, where can we create new models of public-private partnership? Where can we get new sorts of relationships? Because you guys have that flexibility, and then we can, that's kind of our hack to the system of we can stand on your shoulders and you know, bring in what we need when we need it. But that's where I think a lot of like the real dynamic change is going to have to occur.
So let me riff on that, sir. I think the thing that blew away Silicon Valley, you should understand, was when Sec Hegsworth said, we take 80% functionality for now,
right,
versus 100%.
Right.
Well, that's how, and we'll iterate in the field.
Exactly.
Anybody ever hear that before in a startup?
Minimum viable product.
Right. That's how we build products.
Yep.
And to hear the Army and the whole DOW actually at least say those words was kind of a mind blower for us. Mm-hmm. The question is, how does that actually change the mindset of the entire system that's actually spent decades doing exactly the opposite? You alluded to that as, you know, and there's a phrase in commercial companies called the frozen middle. When disruption hits, everybody looks at their watch and says, well, this will pass, and gee, these people will, you know, they'll cycle out and we'll do something else. How does this become permanent part of the culture rather than just transitory?
I'm very familiar with the frozen middle, which exists in the government as well. I think Sec Army and I reflect on this a lot. I think the example that he and General George set, I think, is kind of a good starting point, and we're making some of the structural changes. But I don't think there's a silver bullet to any of it. I think you have to bracket these things in a number of different ways to make them durable and kind of last beyond the personalities that currently occupy leadership offices. I think fundamentally we have to look at the incentives, how folks get graded. I talked about the new definition of failure is like a failure to move fast. And so I think just recalibrating people's risk assessments and understanding whose risk they are assuming and not getting out over beyond their own remit to take risk off the table, if that should belong to somebody else. And so I think until you kind of get in and really change those sorts of dynamics, you're just moving deck chairs around. So that's where I think it just takes some time to pull some of those changes through to fruition. But if you set those structures in the right place, you change those incentives, I think that helps bracket in the change that we're trying to drive throughout the department.
I think that's awesome. And let me just suggest, and I'm sure you'll hear from folks in the audience later, if there were some published scorecards of how well you're doing in with Silicon Valley or new entrants. I always look at the MDAP list and say any new names, and not even going that far, but just like, and this was a question I asked you earlier in the green room. Is the Army trying to buy products or build new ecosystems?
You had a better answer to that one than me.
I think we're definitely trying to build new ecosystems, especially in my space.
What does that mean?
So that means we need to align industry on common standards, open architectures, standards for physical interfaces, passing data, passing power. So I look at it like this. There's a couple big programs. The Next Gen Command and Control program. Many of you are probably familiar with the tech stack, the layer cake approach, transport, infrastructure, data and applications. Within that, there are a number of companies operating in each one of those. I look at the same thing on autonomy. I've been doing some iterating on what an autonomy tech stack would look like. And as we decomposed it, what we found is that from ground platform autonomy to air platforms and autonomy at that level to communications links, edge compute, orchestration, collaborative autonomy, there are a bunch of sub-levels within that. You need an ecosystem of a bunch of best-of-breed companies operating together to produce the capability outcomes that we need.
But again, building a common platform. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I just want to, riff on the folks in the room. If you're a startup, the answer is usually standards. We don't need no standards. Look what we could do. And that's very different from what an Army needs across a whole diverse set of systems to integrate, right? So there's this constant tension of, gee, I could build something better versus that's nice, but does that make sense?
It is, and there's a tension there. A few years ago, we were very much focused on developing government standards. We've pulled back from that now. What we want is to align industry around industry-developed standards with the recognition that those will be dynamic. They will evolve over time. We have to account for that. So it's getting the right level of standardization without locking it down and it stifles it.
That's a great insight.
On the ecosystem piece, I guess I'll kind of zoom back out. I mean, I think, Fuse is creating, or our attempt to create an ecosystem in the kind of VC material capability space. But, right now to get those things to scale, we still got to hand them over to the PAEs. Yes. So is there an alternate path? Is there an alternate construct that we could employ to accelerate that? Another area that we're doing a lot in terms of trying to reset our relationship with private industry is through our strategic capital initiative. We are currently sifting through hundreds of responses. We put out an RFI back in April where we're effectively looking to create kind of a new frontier of public-private partnership. And the key thing is I can go all day long with an RFP and say, sell me this thing. But then the reality is we're under a CR. We can't do new starts. We can't do production rate increases. We can't move money around. And so this is what I was alluding to when I said, I think the hack is developing new relationships with industry is bring me a model or help us think through a model where you're not solely reliant on appropriated funds for your ROI. Is it a diverse customer base? Is there some sort of dual use thing? And then let's let's fund some of our infrastructure needs through that sort of a model, and we can sign up and figure out ways that we can de-risk the investment, whether it's to an anchor customer or whatever that is. But I think we're trying to kind of create that ecosystem in a number of areas. And like on Fuse specifically, like we need more of a stable venture capitalists that are ready to kind of invest in these technologies that are winning our competitions, but then how does that join up with what we're trying to do on the infrastructure side? And so maybe we don't have to go do a raise every time to facilitize. Maybe we can come into an Army organic industrial base site and start developing additional prototypes to push out to the units. So we're trying to think through like where these sorts of overlaps are. And again, the call to industry is like, you guys are kind of living this every day from your side and seeing what's really not working. Sometimes it's very hard for us to get clear-eyed assessments of like where we're going wrong. And so, bring that to us. My office is, I've got John Oliver, my XO, is running around here somewhere. He's the guy. He's my little evil genius back there. So if you guys get linked up with him, you got a direct line into me. Bring us your thoughts, see what we can do better, see if there's creative ideas that we haven't thought through yet, and then like we can figure out how to kind of put those things in action.
So, sir, you answered the last question I was going to ask, which is, what can we do for you, and how can we help? And I just want everybody to hear that. The Army is asking, and so's the DOW, for new ideas on how to engage whole nation, rather than just,
Absolutely.
gee, we have this budget for the Army, and that's our zero-sum game, and that's all we could spend. That's not what China's done in the last 15 years. They've engaged their entire nation.
Yep.
And I think that was the request I just heard.
Absolutely.
Right.
And just I'll end on a positive note, which is me saying very sincerely thank you to you guys for what you're doing. So we did an AI TTX back in the fall.
TTX?
Tabletop exercise, where we presented some operational vignettes of like, here's our operational problems with data transport in a certain theater where there's long distances, low bandwidth, like stuff like that. Like, how would you solve these problems for us? And then we were able to take the concepts or the ideas that were floated in that conference room, and within 90 days get them up on the rail as fully resourced projects.
Awesome.
But the only way we were able to do that is the caliber of folks that came in for that meeting. I think we did back of the napkin math, and there was like 20 CEOs that represented about 17 trillion in enterprise value. But that started with the Sec Army and I just calling these individuals, and the response that we got was as telling as it is kind of infuriating, which was, we've been waiting for this call. Like, nobody from the Pentagon has ever called and asked for our help. And they all came out, they all rearranged their schedules. Some of them canceled board meetings to like stay in the meeting because they saw the sincerity of the ask, and it was really inspiring. And so like we've kind of run that same model. I know Sam's getting antsy, but the headline is, industry is willing to meet us where we are and work with us and answer the call. And so like very sincerely appreciate everything that we're seeing from, you talk about ecosystems, from that relationship, and I just am very excited about where it's going. I think we're on a good path.
General, what would you ask for the community, tech, venture capital, et cetera?
I think a couple things. First of all, who are your teammates? A lot of times I'll do an industry engagement, and one of the questions I always ask is, who are you working with out there in industry? If you're working in sustainment, for example, from the predictive logistics piece of collecting the data, understanding our supply status, to pushing things forward, delivering supplies at the point in time of need. Understanding that bigger problem, who the key players are, and bringing us solutions tied in with that full ecosystem is very important. The second thing is, stick with us. I would argue that we haven't always been a very good customer. We change our mind, we don't follow through. Can bring, I'm sure from industry's perspective, it can seem like a bring me a rock kind of drill. We are trying hard to be a better customer. The reorganization that we did, the stand up of the PAEs, the PIT, we're working hard to communicate better and get better outcomes. So stick with us. I've said, for the past year, since I got to AFC about a year ago, I see all the investment in dual use and in defense tech right now. Feel like we've got a window of opportunity to capitalize on it, or else that investment may go somewhere else. I don't want to see it go somewhere else. I want to continue to fuel the fire here. So keep it coming.
I want to thank you, gentlemen, and just for the audience, if you haven't seen the Department of War directory, it's online. Now the first phone book for find out where these guys are. But I want to thank you very much. Excellent. Sir? Great.
Thank you very
Awesome.
much, sir. Appreciate you.
Really
Yeah,
impressed.
thank